Jacinta Price appears to be the biggest winner from the Voice referendum. She's been talked about as a possible future Prime Minister. This would make her Australia's first Indigenous Prime Minister. However, it begs the question of whether the case for a Prime Minister Jacinta Price actually makes sense, and what needs to be done to put her into contention. The main argument in Jacinta Price's favour is she was extremely effective during the Voice referendum. Whether you agree or disagree with all of her statements, she had cut through, and she was plain talking. For example, at a National Press Club address, she bluntly accused the Yes campaign of lying.
A massive disservice is done to the Australian people and indeed has contributed to the division created by this debate. When government talking points are being laundered as facts, despite there being clear agendas stated by the designers of The Voice, and despite the government assurances being often flagrantly contradictory and incoherent. The Voice is flawed in its foundations. It is built on lies and an aggressive attempt to fracture our nation's founding document and divide the country built upon it.
Another example is her comments on colonialism.
In your speech, you claimed some Indigenous organisations, quote, want to demonise colonial settlement. Could I ask you, please, do you believe the history of colonisation continues to have an impact on some Indigenous Australians?
No. I'll be honest with you, no, I don't think so. Positive impact, absolutely. I mean, now we've got running water, we've got readily available food. I mean, everything that my grandfather had when he was growing up, because he first saw whitefellas in his early adolescence, we now have.
Now, whether or not you agree with her comments, her communication style was effective for the time, and effective for a large portion of the electorate. Hence why we saw the results we did in the referendum, which are partly attributable to the leadership from people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine. Now, like I've said, not all people agree with her comments, but her comments had cut through, and they definitely were effective in communicating what she said. Now, her comments were significantly more effective than those of either Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton. Anthony Albanese, for example, was often speaking in platitudes and emotive waffle.
The Uluru Statement from the Heart was an invitation extended with humility, grace and optimism for the future. I promised our government would seek to answer the generous and gracious call of those 440 powerful words.
Now, Anthony Albanese's communication style might be fine for a high school drama class or an English class, but it is completely ineffective and inappropriate for a policy debate where people have serious concerns about the details and specifics of, in this case, the Voice referendum. Sidestepping technical details and just doing emotional calls was simply unconvincing, and it failed to persuade voters. This partly explains why the referendum had such poor results. Anthony Albanese also compares badly with other ALP ministers. Anthony Albanese's sheer lack of effective leadership was partly why the Voice referendum failed, and also stunning in contrast to Jacinta Price's advocacy is why the No campaign succeeded. Now, Peter Dutton had also had issues with cut-through. He presents as rather dithering. He looks like he's too scared of being attacked to make a clear and strident stance. This was the case with the Voice referendum, where he took a very long time to really get a point across, but has also been the case with various other policies, such as the ALP's superannuation tax grab, or for example the communications around the misinformation bill that the ALP has put up that would significantly harm free speech. Peter Dutton simply hasn't had cut-through. Whereas Jacinta Price said that the Yes campaign was full of lies, Peter Dutton equivocated. Peter Dutton's approach might have been more conciliatory, more diplomatic, but it wasn't necessarily inspiring. Both Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton appeared to be boring, albeit for slightly different reasons. For Anthony Albanese, it was the emotional waffle and the sheer failure to actually answer questions. For Peter Dutton, it was simply because he was too slow-moving and seemed to be too reticent to actually commit. Now, you might say that I'm boring, but I'm also not running for Prime Minister. Jacinta Price also has a compelling backstory with quote-unquote lived experience, to use the trendy term. Lived experience from remote communities. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that lived experience necessarily makes you a better politician, because a lot of these policies are really going to be quite technical in nature, and the lived experience is anecdotal in nature rather than technical or empirical necessarily, but it certainly is useful for convincing people you know what you're talking about. This also makes her more relatable than many politicians in either the ALP or in the coalition. Many of the ALP politicians seem to be inner-city progressives, at least the ones in the leadership team. People like Anthony Albanese or Jim Chalmers, for example. Many of the coalition are also seen as wealthy or out of touch. However, the silver lining of the Teals is they've slightly ameliorated this by seizing several of the wealthiest electorates in Sydney and in Melbourne, thereby partly severing the coalition's association with large wealth. By contrast, Jacinta Price might hope to capture aspirational voters, maybe harking back to John Howard's battlers, for example. Now, so far we can see a lot of positives associated with Jacinta Price. However, there are some hurdles that she will need to overcome to really be able to be a Prime Minister. First, Jacinta Price is in the Senate. By convention and by practice, Prime Ministers come from the House. She is a senator from the Northern Territory as well. Now, usually a party, the coalition or the ALP, would find a House seat for a promising politician such as Jacinta Price. However, there aren't really any good seats for the coalition in the Northern Territory. They're all held by the ALP. Therefore, Jacinta Price would likely need to move states. Whether this is palatable to her, well, that's a personal decision. But it also raises issues for the electorate. The coalition would need to ensure that she isn't regarded as a fly into an electorate that is just brought in to ensure she gets elected. Rather, they need to ensure that she is sufficiently connected to that local community and lays the groundwork for that far in advance. Now, like I've indicated, the Prime Minister in theory could come from the Senate, but they basically never do. And I suspect that that convention is extremely unlikely to change anytime soon. The second issue is that Jacinta Price is in her first term. Therefore, she lacks the policy experience to immediately become Prime Minister. This isn't to say she needs to wait around for decades or, quote, do her time, but it is to say that building up policy experience in budget setting or foreign relations or various other things will be beneficial if one intends to become Prime Minister. This would include, for example, involvement in budget setting, or at least the response to the ALP's budget, involvement in financial portfolios. If the coalition aims for her to become Prime Minister, it would be useful to have her involved in some of these senior shadow cabinet positions. She currently doesn't have that type of involvement. Now, this isn't to say she couldn't have that type of involvement. She could, in fact, be quite effective in those portfolios. However, it will be useful for her to build up those levels of experience. And that will also make her more compelling to the broader voter base. Third, Jacinta Price could soften some of her rhetoric. Now, Jacinta Price has said a lot of correct things throughout the campaign. Jacinta Price had a lot of cut-through. Jacinta Price also, oft-times, spoke truth to power, so to speak. However, some of her comments probably could have been reined in a little bit. For example, after the referendum result, Jacinta Price called for an investigation into the conduct of the Australian Electoral Commission in remote or regional polling locations. Now, she may be making a valid point about the conduct of the Yes campaign. The possibility the Yes campaign was allowed to be excessively aggressive near polling places. She may be quite correct there. However, her comments came across as criticising the AEC, but the AEC was possibly not even resourced very well in those locations. They possibly didn't actually have the personnel to be able to do a lot of what Jacinta Price would want them to do. Perhaps a better way to communicate that would be to criticise the Yes campaign and emphasise the AEC should be supported to be able to perform its duties to the best of its ability. There's a subtle difference in that communication, but it comes across less as criticising the AEC and more as criticising the Yes campaign, which to some extent is going to play a lot better. Sometimes it's better for politicians to not deliver every message in an accusatorial manner. So it could be beneficial for Jacinta Price to rein in some of her communications. Keep the cut-through, keep the clarity, keep the plain speaking, but possibly just rein in some of the criticisms that are possibly going a little bit too far. But overall, Jacinta Price certainly shows a lot of promise as a potential future Prime Minister. Whether or not she gets there, or whether she flames out like Mark Latham, well, that remains to be seen. But certainly she's someone that the coalition should certainly try to nurture as a future political leader, and if at all possible, find a good House seat for her to be able to get elected into, so she could potentially occupy a prime ministerial or at least a senior cabinet position. So those are my thoughts about whether Jacinta Price could become a Prime Minister. I think she shows a lot of promise. I think the coalition would be well served by nurturing that talent, and I think with some subtle improvements to her communication, she could have even more cut-through than she currently does. But do let me know your thoughts about whether she's a possible future Prime Minister in the comments below. I'd be interested to hear what you think.